Hi again, everyone. Welcome back to our Persian history lecture series. This video is going to focus in particular on the later reign of Artaxerxes II and the problem of secessionist Egypt. How are the Persians going to deal with the loss of this vital imperial province? What can they do to try to take it back? And why does reconquest take so long? The Persians lost Egypt to local rebels around the year 404 BCE. It would take them until the 340s BCE to effect a successful reconquest. And although Artaxerxes II has the longest reign in Achaemenid imperial history, from 404 to 358, he proves unable throughout this reign to bring back this crucial portion of the empire. So we're going to try to think about some of the factors in this. Once again, we lack Persian internal sources for most of this period. There are a few Babylonian chronicles and astronomical diaries that deal with isolated events of Persian military action in Cyprus and Phoenicia at a few points in the 300s BCE, but mostly we're reliant on Greek sources. Our Greek sources for these particular events are late and fragmentary. In general, the most important of them is Diodorus of Sicily, who again is excerpting and summarizing earlier work, mostly from a lost Greek historian named Ephorus. Ephorus wrote in the 300s BCE, so he was a contemporary, certainly with the Persian reconquest of Egypt in the 340s. Diodorus, though, is excerpting his work in the 50s BCE. So what we can get from Diodorus is a narrative framework for some of the Persian military campaigns into Egypt. We know that Diodorus doesn't describe all of them in detail. We have some hints, and there's some disputed dates for some of the early Persian efforts. There seems to be a Persian attempt in the 390s, possibly one in the 380s, the BCE. But the one that we see described in the most detail happened in 373. And this is an invasion of Egypt led by Pharnabazus, the famous Persian general, which ended up being a military failure. You have in your readings Diodorus' account of that unsuccessful invasion in 373, as well as his account of the successful Persian reconquest in the 340s. That's traditionally dated by Diodorus to 343, but some scholars think it may have happened as late as the year 340. Now, a few factors are important for understanding Persia's problem here. Egypt is a vital province. It had traded with Athens throughout the 5th century BCE, and that trade actually resumes and helps to enrich the Egyptian kingdom during the 4th century, when it's separate from Persian rule. Egypt is enormously wealthy. It's easy to understand why the Persians want it back. The Egyptian rebels are also divided among themselves. The first rebel pharaoh who succeeded in gaining control of Egypt, Artaxerxes, seems to have ruled for only a short time, and his rule is contested by other rival Egyptian warlords in the Nile Delta. Artaxerxes is eventually overthrown. He's replaced by another pharaoh named Nepherites, who himself seems to face continuing competition from other would-be Egyptian leaders. The subsequent Egyptian ruler, Nectanebo I, has a longer reign, but still Egypt faces this problem of internal revolt and division, which one would have expected the Persians to try to exploit to their own advantage. Yet they don't. The Persians basically fail to do any major military response to Egypt's rebellion from 404 down to at least 392. So try to understand why this is the case. We can think in some ways about things that are happening elsewhere in the empire. We're poorly informed about the center and eastern half of the empire, but we know that these are the years of Cyrus's rebellion and then the Persian-Spartan War of the 390s. While the Persians stabilized that situation in 394 and 393, it takes until 387 for the king's peace to be issued and for peace to extend across the Aegean frontier. Now, why didn't the Persians invade Egypt with an army in 403, right after Amartayas took over Egypt? Why didn't they invade in 400, as soon as Cyrus was put down? We're not entirely sure, but part of the problem is the length of time that it takes to build up extensive naval resources. The reconquest of Egypt would have to involve a large fleet. The Egyptian rebels took the Nile Delta very early on. They took key fortresses that controlled the mouths of the Nile Delta. We know that Cyrus had a fleet of several triremes in the Mediterranean that he had used early in his rebellion. And at the end of his revolt, those ships all fled to Egypt and are confiscated by the pharaohs. So they have naval forces that can defend the Nile River mouths, as well as the supporting fortresses. An invasion would have to involve an army coming overland through the Sinai and a fleet carrying its supplies and maybe combat forces to try to fight its way into the Nile River mouths. But Persia has lacked a large standing Mediterranean fleet, or the need for one, since the peace with Athens in the mid-5th century. We know the Persians possessed 147 warships in 411 BCE, when these threatened to intervene in the Peloponnesian War but then pulled back to the Phoenician coast. But triremes typically have a shelf life of 10 to 20 years. And without extensive upkeep, they very quickly become unserviceable for serious naval combat and suitable only for transporting troops and supplies. 147 ships, even if these are still lying around in some of the Phoenician dockyards, might have been considered an insufficient number to try to make an all-out naval assault on the Nile Delta. What's clear is that in the 390s, while Artaxerxes II is trying to deal with the Spartans and the Ionian Greeks, he is simultaneously building new ships. Greek sources mention large surges of Achaemenid shipbuilding on the island of Cyprus and in Phoenicia. And we know from a number of ancient sources that warship building is an expensive and time-consuming process. You could probably put together a squadron of 100 or so ships built from scratch in a year if you are building very, very fast, but the ships might not be entirely seaworthy for several more months. You also need time to recruit and train crews who might not have extensive experience of rowing and military naval service. And you need all sorts of stockpiles in order to supply this sort of large fleet. Herodotus says a trireme crew is 200 men in strength. That also appears in a number of other Greek authors. Some evidence, including some ship sheds, that is, garages for triremes, discovered at a city in Cyprus called Kidion, suggests that some Persian triremes made in Phoenicia may have been somewhat smaller than a number of the models used in Athens at the same time. Maybe we're dealing with smaller crews, maybe more like 150 men instead of 200. But even so, when you put more than 100 of them in the water and multiply that by 150, you're getting a very large number, tens of thousands of sailors requiring long-term sustenance. There's also a tradition that's become highly developed in the Peloponnesian War era of pay in silver for sailors. And again, there are financial resources that need to be assembled and massed at naval dockyards in order to make a long-term campaign possible. So for all of these reasons, the Persians don't have the naval resources in place for a rapid response to the Egyptian crisis. And when they try to build them up, they face distractions such as the war in the Aegean Sea, which diverts part of the Persian fleet for the time that it takes to defeat the Spartan navy and restore something of order on the Aegean front. There's also the problem of the River Nile and its annual flood. Egypt can only be invaded effectively by land forces at certain times of year. The Nile flood for much of the summer, the typical military campaign season elsewhere, makes Egypt's cities virtually inaccessible, turns them into fortress islands in this massive lake of the Nile. So again, the Persian military campaigns have to rely on pinpoint timing in order to enter Egypt at the right moment, secure the right fortresses with very rapid takeovers and no lengthy sieges. And they've got to move inland before the flood comes. So for these reasons, the Persian response time is slow. Although Egypt matters more than many other provinces, it's much harder to mobilize a takeover. Back in the time of Inaros's revolt in the 460s and 450s, the rebels had not captured the capital, and much of Egypt had stayed in Persian hands. So Persian invading forces could rely on local support. But that's not the case when they try to go into Egypt in the 390s. So this probably plays a role in delaying the Persian invasions of Egypt and then preventing their success. When you get to the Diodorus readings, you're going to see a description of a large-scale Persian campaign. Diodorus, again, like all Greek sources on Persian armies, gives probably exaggerated numbers. He suggests we've got 200,000 troops and many hundreds of warships involved in the invasion. But Diodorus does give some sense of the difficulties that a invasion of Egypt would face. He suggests that Pharnabazus moves into the Nile Delta, confronts a border fortress in the eastern delta at Pelusium, and quickly gets bogged down. As Diodorus explains it, the Persian invasion forces then have a potential strategic option to try to outflank the Egyptian defenders by landing troops at a different Nile River mouth further west. And hopefully then they could coordinate an offensive from multiple directions. They land forces at a mouth of the Nile near the Egyptian city of Mendes, manage to seize a beachhead, and the idea is that the commander responsible might then move upriver and try to link up with Persian forces. Moving inland. According to Diodorus, this clever plan would have worked if only Pharnabazus had listened to the clever Greeks who thought of it. The plan is attributed to a man named Iphicrates, a famous Athenian general who also moonlights as a mercenary commander in different parts of the Aegean Sea. He had been the protege of Conon, the Athenian who worked for Persia and won the Battle of Cnidus against the Spartans in 394. In 373, Iphicrates is actually an elected general and state official of the Athenian democracy, but he is acting in the capacity of Athens' new alliance with the Persian Empire. Again, an indicator of Persia's diplomatic influence over the Greek world after the king's peace. Now, Iphicrates is basically loaned out by Athens to Persia with Greek mercenary forces, who are part of Pharnabazus' invasion force trying to retake Egypt. According to Diodorus, these Greek mercenaries are the only capable troops within the entire Persian military establishment. Iphicrates is a genius, and Pharnabazus is a stubborn fool who won't listen to him. He's too cautious. He basically gets terrified that the beachhead at Mendes can't be sustained, and that it could come to grief if it moved separately from the main Persian force, and so he throws away his chance, quarrels with Iphicrates, and then the Nile flood comes and the campaign has to end. Modern scholarship, though, has been a little critical of Diodorus' version here. It's clearly rooted in Greek supremacist ideas of The Greeks as the central and the most intelligent people in the universe, the Persians as barbarians who are lesser in wisdom and military knowledge to their Greek neighbors. The Greeks are the hero of this story, and in fact, as has been argued in a recent book by the historian Jeff Ropp, there's a pattern of this sort of storytale that happens multiple occasions in Diodorus. Diodorus seems to like this idea of Greeks inside Persian armies as the only capable forces, and basically when Persians win, Greeks are credited for their success. When they lose, Diodorus says that the Persians should have listened to the Greeks and only then could they have won. In fact, this is highly oversimplifying the situation. As Ropp suggests, the Greek presence within the Persian army is, again, an illustration of Persian imperial strength in this period. They're able to recruit from the Greek world that had once defied them, but they form components of much larger Persian imperial armies that shouldn't simply be discounted based on their ethnic origin. We don't know all of the reasons why the 373 campaign breaks down, but it's clear that Pharnabazus is a commander with extensive experience for many decades in Persian service. And what Iphicrates was supposedly suggesting was a risky maneuver. There was no guarantee that separate columns moving up different branches of the Nile would in fact manage to rejoin forces again, and that they wouldn't be attacked and defeated separately by the Egyptians. Now, the subsequent portions of Artaxerxes II's reign are dominated in the Greek accounts by court scandal, by a sense of intrigue, by satraps revolting against the king. Diodorus is the primary, not actually a primary source, a secondary source, but he's the main source responsible for giving this impression of an empire whose western half is dissolving into chaos. Again, modern scholars do not take Diodorus's accounts at face value. They suggest that some of the satrapal revolts that occurred in the 360s in parts of Anatolia were basically localized affairs. We do see outbreaks of local turbulence, sometimes violent rivalries between local district governors, but the majority seem to remain in a loyalist position, supporting the Persian crown. And there's certainly no sense of a conspiracy among all Persia's western governors to rise up against the king. Plutarch's Life of Artaxerxes treats these later years of his reign as a series of scandals designed to try to showcase the effeminacy and moral weakness of the Persian Empire. Again, stereotypes of barbarian luxury and decadence are highlighted in Plutarch's account based on earlier lost Greek sources that gave this tabloid-esque description of what was going on in Artaxerxes' inner circle. So we hear these tales of Artaxerxes being dominated by eunuchs and women at his court. It's clear that at certain points in his later reign there are problems. His oldest son and heir, who's named Darius, is executed after an alleged assassination plot against the king. We'd like to know more about the backstory for that particular situation. But on the other hand, some of the other sexualized scandals that Plutarch reports, such as the alleged incest between Artaxerxes II and one of his daughters, have to be taken with a very significant grain of salt. Now, ultimately, Artaxerxes II dies in old age in the year 358 BCE. He's succeeded by one of his sons, who takes the throne name Artaxerxes III. Again, an indicator of the respect with which the late king is known in the Persian Empire. Artaxerxes III would reign from 358 to 338 BCE, a 20-year reign of which unfortunately we know very little. But we see that he is able to stabilize the military situation in the areas where the Persians have had problems on their western Mediterranean front. There's a revolt in Cyprus, there's a revolt in Phoenicia early in the reign of Artaxerxes III. There had been earlier troubles in Cyprus during Artaxerxes II's reign. They had been put down. Artaxerxes III puts down rebellions in Cyprus and in Phoenicia, where his army sacks the Phoenician city-state of Sidon. Most importantly, after an initial failed attempt, Artaxerxes III personally leads an invasion of Egypt and manages to recapture the entire kingdom of Egypt in 343 or 340. Diodorus again describes Artaxerxes III's successful reconquest, and again you'll read that in your readings. Once again, Diodorus suggests that the entire victory is due to the presence of Greek mercenaries in the Persian army. And basically he credits Greek mercenaries with the key captures of fortresses in the Nile Delta that bring about Persian success. What is interesting about these Greeks is that they come from multiple city-states on the Greek mainland. The city of Thebes and the city of Argos both send troops and generals to serve in the Persian army. They may not be the only ones playing a role in Persia's victory over this last Egyptian rebel pharaoh, Nectanebo II. But their presence, again, suggests Persia's success in dealing with Greek diplomacy, managing to work through periodic quarrels, and continuing to project influence across the sea on its northwestern frontier. Artaxerxes III successfully retakes Egypt. We know he engages in some building at Persepolis, as had Artaxerxes II. Artaxerxes II and III are both buried in tombs carved into the cliffside at Persepolis, above the Achaemenid palace terrace. And an interesting feature of Artaxerxes III's tomb is that it replicates the tomb design that we've seen in the tombs of all of the Achaemenid kings at Naxche-Rustam, and then their Persepolis copies. But for the first time since the tomb reliefs of Darius I, Artaxerxes III has a very short inscription accompanying his tomb relief. It shows the throne bearer scene. Again, the representatives of the different ethnic groups of the Persian Empire holding up the king's thrones on their hands, over their heads, participating together in this display of unity in diversity and propagandistic support for Achaemenid royal power, blessed by Ahura Mazda, the patron god of the empire. There's an interesting feature, though, in these ethnic captions. They include a full subject list that goes back to the lists of the empire's peoples propagated by Darius the Great. In particular, they include the Ionians, or Yauna, the name Persians give the Greeks, and the Yauna across the sea. This is traditionally regarded as a piece of anachronistic propaganda. This late Achaemenid ruler in the twilight years of the empire is recopying a subject list from the glory days under Darius the Great. But he has recaptured Egypt, and he's done so with an army partially made up of Greek military recruits. In fact, these Greek military recruits come from the lands of the Yauna across the sea. There's some truth in the propaganda of Artaxerxes III. He does, in fact, rule an empire that extends its influence through diplomatic power across distant lands where Xerxes and Darius I had tried and failed to establish a military threshold, a military presence through direct invasion. So Artaxerxes III would be the last successful emperor or king of the Persian Empire in military terms. He's going to die in 338 BCE on the eve of Persia's invasion by a new foreign threat, the Kingdom of Macedonia.